Unlike some other hypervisors that you'll come across, Proxmox VE has a built-in firewall. This allows you to protect and restrict access to your hypervisors without having to purchase or install additional software. In addition, the firewall can also be used to restrict access to your virtual machines, which is especially useful if you've got operating systems that don't have their own personal firewall software. But more importantly, this allows us to restrict local access. So for instance, traffic between the virtual machines themselves, the type of traffic that your typical dedicated firewall appliance would never see. So what's really useful here is it gives us an extra layer of security. But how do you configure this Proxmox VE firewall? Well, if that's something that you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. Now, the first thing to point out is that by default a firewall is disabled, but you can also configure it at different levels. So if we come to the data center level here, if we then come down to here where it says firewall, click on that. This is where you configure firewall rules. We've then got options. Now, this setting here I would refer to as the master switch. By default it's set to no, and until that's actually configured and set to yes, the firewall is turned off. So it makes no difference what other firewall settings you put in, they'll have no effect until the actual firewall itself is turned on. We've then got security groups, aliases, and IP sets, which we'll go over later. At a hypervisor level, we've also got our firewall settings as well. So here, if I click on that, we can configure firewall rules. We've also got options that we can set. Now, by default, the firewall is actually enabled at this level. But again, because it's actually disabled at the data center level, it's not actually having any effect. And we can also come here to actually check logs for the actual hypervisor. If we then go to a virtual machine, that's also got a firewall setting. So if we click on that, we can configure firewall rules for our virtual machine. We've got options. Now, by default, that's actually set to no. So even if we turn it on at a data center level, there's no firewalling taking place on the actual virtual machine until you edit this and change it to yes. We can also configure aliases, IP sets, and we can also check the logs here for the virtual machine. Now, one other thing I'll point out is if we go to hardware and then select our network card, click on edit, by default, firewalling is enabled on the actual network card itself. But again, it's just that by default, we've got this setting set to no, meaning there isn't actually any firewalling taking place anyway, at least not by default. So in order to use this firewall, we do actually need to turn it on. So we go to data center, then firewall, then options, and then what we would do is enable the feature here. But, and I do stress that, we don't have any actual firewall rules defined. So if we go up a level to firewall, there are no rules defined here. If we go to one of our nodes, we've got no rules defined there. And like a typical firewall, this has an implicit deny rule. So because we don't have any rules defined, it means traffic will get dropped. In other words, if we enable this firewall, chances are we'll end up locking ourselves out. So that's something you really need to be aware of. Don't just enable that firewall feature without at least actually creating the actual rules first. Having said that, this particular firewall does have a twist. It does cover them in the documentation, but it is something I want to point out. So I'm going to do this for demo purposes, but it isn't something I recommend you do. So I'm going to go to firewall, click on edit, then I'm going to select the firewall option there. I'm going to click OK, and then that should enable the firewall. It's enabled at a data center level, meaning that the actual hypervisors should now be firewalled, but not the virtual machines. So if I go and click somewhere else, you can see that we've now got essentially a bit of spinning wheel going on. In other words, we have actually locked ourselves out. I didn't create any rules, so not surprisingly, I can't get actual access. Doesn't matter where I click. I mean, there's some obviously caching going on within the browser as such, but we are actually locked out from the actual GUI, and there's nothing I can do. I can't get back in at this stage. Now, interestingly enough, if I go to this SSH session that I've got, if I hit return, this is an actual SSH session that I'd opened up before. Can't get access to that either. Now, for a web browser, it's not unusual to be locked out because it's not a permanent connection. For an SSH session, on the other hand, it is, because typically with a firewall, when you've actually got a connection already open, the firewall, when you actually enable it or make changes, usually firewalls don't actually disconnect existing sessions. They do keep them open. But in this case, it doesn't. So that's something you need to be aware of. If you go through the documentation, it does give you a recommendation to actually have an SSH session open. But I don't have that option. So the trouble is, I am now actually locked out. But like I said, there is a bit of a twist here. Now, just to point out, this particular computer that I've been using to actually connect to Proxmox and to actually enable a firewall is remote to the actual hypervisors. In other words, it's in a different network. Now, this computer, on the other hand, is actually in the same network as the actual hypervisors. So I can actually continue on with my connection to Proxmox through the GUI. I mean, we didn't actually create any rules to allow this. So if I go back to the actual node, for instance, again, there's no rules being defined here. If we go to the data center, there's no rules defined there, but the firewall is enabled. So in other words, the actual remote computer is being locked out, but not the local computer. I mean, I've got a putty session for this one as well, and that's still working. So that is something to bear in mind, is that like your typical firewall, it does have an implicit deny rule to drop traffic. But what the developers have also done is they've set up some other rules that you don't see here, which allow local access even once the actual firewall is enabled. So by default, the actual firewall is disabled, which means you've got local access. Even if you turn the firewall on without defining any rules, then by default, you'll still continue to have local access. The whole point of actually setting up a firewall like this really is to actually restrict local access. So that's something that you really need to be aware of. Unless you take action, you're still going to end up allowing local access to things like the hypervisors, for instance. Now, if you have managed to lock yourself out and you don't have a local computer that can give you access to your hypervisors, one option is to open up a console session like this and make a change to the configuration file to disable the actual firewall. So to do that, I'm going to type in nano. You need to go to etc/pve/firewall, and the file that I want is called cluster.fw. Hit return. All we've got in here at the moment is just this enable option, which is set to 1. So I'm going to change this to 0. I'm going to save that file. Hit return. Now, if I go back to my local computer, you can see it's already showing the actual firewall is disabled. If I go to the remote one, I'll just refresh this session, because the session itself was actually basically blocked out and disabled. So I'll just try refreshing that and see if we can get access back to it, because essentially we've disabled the firewall, in which case now we've restored our actual remote sessions by just completely disabling the firewall for the entire cluster. Now, in the previous method, we disabled the entire firewall, and in a production environment, you may not actually want that, especially if this is an actual cluster that's already up and running and you just somehow maybe created a rule, for instance, and locked yourself out in some way. If we actually disable the entire cluster, we'll be disabling firewalls on virtual machines and on every node, for example, and you may not necessarily want that. What we can do instead is to actually just disable a firewall service on a particular node and regain access that way. So I've restored the actual firewall here. If we go back to our remote session, you should find, yep, we're spinning our wheels. So if we come back to our console session, put in a command on this specific node to actually stop the firewall service. It only stops the firewall on this specific node. So if I go back to my remote computer and then just click somewhere else, I've got access back to this node again. It takes a while to get itself back together, but what I can now do is go back to the data center level, for example, and I can start making my rule changes here, or I could add rules in for that specific node, for instance. But the key thing is the firewall itself, from a cluster perspective, is still operating. All we've done is just disable the actual firewall service for this specific node. And then once we've done what's necessary to restore service, we can come back to here. And then we'll just restart the firewall back on this node. So that's another alternative option that you could use. Now, when it comes to creating rules for the hypervisors, you can do it at two different levels. We've got the data center level. So if you go to data center and then click on firewall here, you've got an option to click add, and you can start adding in new rules. Any rules that we create here apply to all of the nodes or hypervisors within that cluster. On the other hand, I can go to a specific hypervisor, select its firewall settings, and I've got exactly the same add button here where I can start creating individual rules for that hypervisor. But personally, I'd say it makes more sense to centralize all your rules. It makes the whole administration process a whole lot easier. Now, the goal is to restrict access to these actual hypervisors. In other words, I only want certain computers being able to get access. And one of the things I certainly want to do is to block local access. So to do that, we're going to do this at a data center level. So we go to data center, then to firewall here. And if I click on add, I can start to add in rules, but we want to be as specific as we possibly can. And that includes specifying the interface. Now, there isn't a drop-down option here. So for that reason, I've deliberately got all of these actual hypervisors set up so they've got the exact same network interfaces, but you would have to double check. But if we go to system and network, I've got a series of interfaces on this actual computer, and I just need to be specific in terms of which interface is which. So VMBR0, for instance, is my management interface. So in which case I'm going to go to data center, back to firewall, click on add, and I'm going to specify that as the actual interface because I only want management access allowed on that specific interface. For the source, well, it's giving me a drop-down option, but we haven't defined any options at this stage. So I'm going to put in an IP address at this point. So I'm just going to put in the IP address of my remote PC. For the destination, well, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to specify this one specific computer, specifically this node that I've got here. That's what its IP address is, because I want to be, as I say, as specific as possible. So I've put in its IP address. It just means that I'm going to have to repeat this rule for each individual hypervisor though. Now, I can put in a comment. So I could say management access, for example. I've got choices here for a macro. So if you click on the drop down option, there's a series of known actual applications that you can select from. But what we're going to do is we're going to keep things simple, really, to just have as few rules as possible. So I'm actually going to start setting actual destination ports. So in this case, I want to allow access to port 8006, for instance. I also want to allow SSH. So if I put in a comma and then put in 22 for SSH, I'm now specifying what the destination is. Not really bothered what the actual source port is, but I do need to be specific about the protocol. So we need to set this to TCP. So we'll then click on add. Now, by default, that rule isn't enabled. And that's quite useful because I'm going to actually start repeating these rules. And the problem is you can find out the actual rules end up going right to the top. So if you enable a rule that blocks things, for instance, you could end up locking yourself out. So I find it's better to leave the rule disabled and shuffle things around, move them around, put them in an order that you want, and then start enabling them. But what I can do is I can actually copy rules and just make my life a bit easier. So I'll change that to 11 because that's the other hypervisor. Copy that again. And then 12 is my other hypervisor. And what I can do is I can actually drag these and move them into position, for instance. So this is just something you have to bear in mind, as I say, is the fact that you'll end up, every time you create a new rule, it just ends up going right at the top of the list. So I've now got those in a nice numerical order. And what I can do is I can actually enable them from here. I don't have to actually go back right into the rule to enable them. But that at least sets up some very basic rules to allow access specifically from that computer to all three hypervisors on those specific ports. Well, now that we've actually got some rules set up which allow access from our remote management computer to our three hypervisors, if we turn the firewall on this time, we should still be able to get access. So we'll go down to Options, click on Firewall, then click on Edit. Tick that option to enable the firewall. And then if I start just clicking around, I've still got access to the actual devices within the cluster. So everything is still working this time round. If I go to an SSH session, that's still working as well. So by putting those rules in, we do have our actual access from our remote computer. The only catch is, well, if we go to our local computer, we've still got access from the actual local computer as well. Now, bear in mind, there's already an upstream firewall, which is basically controlling remote access to these hypervisors and virtual machines. So we haven't really gained anything as such. What we really want to do is to actually restrict local access as well, but those built-in rules still exist. So we need to actually start disabling them. So because I only want to allow management access to these hypervisors from that one specific machine, I'm going to click on Add, and I'm going to create a rule to block all other traffic on this management interface. So we're going to change the action to drop. And then for the interface, we'll put in VMBR0, which is my management interface. I don't need to specify a source, a destination, source port, destination port, macro or protocol, because really we don't care. We just want to block everything else. These are the only rules that I need to allow access, so all other traffic should get blocked. One thing I'll point out is I do not want to enable this actual rule because it'll go straight to the top as soon as I create it, and that will certainly lock me out. I will give it a comment, so I'll just say block other management access, for example. Now, I do want to log all this, so I'll change it from no logging to, for example, to warning. And then I'll click on Add. As you can see, it's gone right to the top of the list, so we'll drag this right to the bottom. And now what we'll do is we'll enable that rule. So if I start clicking around here, I should still be able to get access from this specific computer because I've got rules in place that are allowing access from this one computer. If I go back to my local computer, you can see how it's starting to spin its wheels. It's a bit deceptive. It takes a while to take effect, but you can see now I'm basically locked out. I can't get access. If I open up a PuTTY session and try and get access from PuTTY, so PDE-node1, nothing. Open up a command prompt. I can't even ping the computer from the local network. If I go back to my remote computer, on the other hand, yeah, it's still working. And that's because although there are built-in rules, the rules that I'm defining here are actually rules that are taking precedence. So by setting up that rule there, I've made sure that there is no local access to these hypervisors. However, there is a bit of a catch, and that's because we're only connected into node 1. And what we've got here is a GUI that gives us access to all of the other nodes. Now, if I start to click on these other nodes, it's starting to actually spin its wheels, essentially. The reason being is when you're connecting to these other nodes, it's actually getting proxied through this node. So I need to add in some other rules to allow me to be able to carry on getting access to all of the actual nodes through this one window pane essentially. I mean, I would still be able to get access to the individual nodes themselves through separate sessions, but I quite like the ability to be able to just jump from one node to the other within that one pane of glass. So in order for me to be able to get access to, say, node 2, for instance, through this session that I've got connected to node 1, I actually need to set up a rule that allows access from node 1 to node 2. So if I click on Add, I'll specify the interface as VMB0. I need to specify the source, which is 172.16.19.10. Destination 172.16.19.11. Protocol will be TCP. Destination port 8006 and 22. Because what you'll find is there's actually a lot of things actually get tunneled between these computers. So you want to have that port 22 opened as well. So just give this a comment. Let's see, local hypervisor access. Assuming I could spell, of course. Add that rule in. I'll have to drag this a bit further down. Then we'll enable that rule. So it's essentially the same access that I'm providing the actual local computer that I've got. Except, as I say, that port 22 is just it just gets used because they do quite a lot of tunneling. But if I click on node number 2, you can see I can now actually get access to it. I can't get access to node 3 though. That's blocked out because I haven't actually created a rule to allow access from node 1 to node 3, so I'd have to repeat that. The only thing is I'd also have to set up rules to allow access from, say, node 1 to node, from node 2 to node 1, node 2 to node 3, and so on. So there's a lot of rules I'd have to actually set up to do this sort of thing. But there is a simpler way to actually do all this. Having said that, there are some other rules that we need to set up to actually restrict other local access. Now these hypervisors have multiple interfaces, and because by default the actual firewall is allowing local access, I need to add in some additional rules to block the possibility of management access on these other interfaces. So in this case I've got a storage interface. Now that should be an isolated network in the sense that there should only be the hypervisors and the NAS that exist there. Similarly with the cluster interface, we should only have hypervisors, but all the same, it's always about least privilege, in which case I should actually be blocking access on these interfaces as well. Now, as it turns out, when it comes to storage, we only need outbound access anyway. So realistically, I could just drop all inbound traffic for the storage interface. And when it actually comes to the cluster interface, there are built-in rules to allow the cluster traffic. So what I could actually do is just block all actual traffic inbound on that interface as well. So if we come back to our actual data center, firewall, what I can do is I can add in individual rules for those interfaces, which I do prefer to do. I mean, this particular firewall doesn't have the ability of hit counters, unfortunately. It would be extremely useful, and that's the reason I would prefer to have individual rules for individual interfaces. So at this stage it doesn't have that ability, but you never know, it might change. In which case I'm going to add in some additional rules to drop traffic on these other interfaces that I've got. So I want one for the storage interface, that's ENS224. So I'll just call that block inbound storage, for example. See my magnetic spell. I do want to log that, but at this stage I'm not going to enable it. I'm going to move that one right down to the end there. Then we'll enable that one. And what I could do, actually, just to make my life a bit easier, I'll just copy that one. This one will be ENS256. Change that to cluster. I don't want to enable that yet, just to be on the safe side. Technically it shouldn't matter because I'm not specifying anything that impacts these interfaces here, but all the same, better to be safe than sorry. So now I've got individual rules to block inbound access. So I should still be able to get management access, which is intended, but we're blocking all local access. We've got outbound access to the NAS, which is all we need. And as I say, there's already inbuilt rules when it comes to the actual cluster interface anyway. So by having these rules, we've locked the hypervisor down. Now at this stage, what we've got are 3 rules here allowing remote management access to all 3 nodes, plus only a single rule that I've set up so far between node 1 and node 2. Now, I set that rule up so that I could get access to node 2 while I've got a session directly to node 1 itself. Now, if I want to get access to node 3, I'm going to have to create another rule from node 1 to node 3. If I want to then start a session to node 2 and get access to node 1 through that, I need another rule from node 2 to node 1. And it means I'm going to have to create a lot of rules like this one to be able to do that sort of thing. But you don't just need these rules specifically for that type of management reason. You need them for the actual functionality of the hypervisors themselves. So if you go over to high availability, for instance, I've got 2 virtual machines being protected. I've got Zorin 1 is set up to run on basically any node. And at the moment it's running on node 1. Zorin 2 should really be running on node 3, but the problem is it's stuck. And the reason being is that node 1 does not have access to node 3, which means I need to start adding in these extra rules, just replicating a rule like this to give connectivity between all of these nodes. Now, this is going to get more and more worse, basically. The more actual hypervisors that you've got within a cluster, you're going to end up with a lot of rules, but you can actually consolidate these, make the administration simpler, but it also then means you're less likely to make a mistake. Now, up to now, we've been defining rules using IP addresses, but it's actually easier to remember a name rather than an IP address. Unfortunately, the firewall gives us an option of aliases. So I'll click alias, I'll then click add. I want to set up an alias specifically for node 1, so I'm going to call this pv-node 1. Now, it asks for this in a CIDR format, so what I could do is, if this had been an entire network, I could define that as 172.16.19.0/24, for instance. This is actually for a specific computer. It's for /32 host. Now, in this case, I don't actually have to have that /32 at the end, so I can leave that off. But I do want to put in a comment. And I'll reference this as being the management interface. Click add, and I've now got an alias that I can use in my rules. So if I go back to Firewall, click add, and then in either the source or the destination, I can now use that alias. So I don't have to keep remembering what its IP address is. I just need to remember what the name of the computer is. So I'm just going to repeat this because I need to set these up for all of the nodes plus my management computer. Now, another way to make rule administration easier is to group things together. So rather than having multiple rules, for instance, where you've got multiple networks all needing access to the same server, you could group those networks together and then just have one rule. And to do that with Proxmox VE here, we create an IP set. So we'll click IP set, click create. Now I want to group my hypervisors together, for example. So I'm going to call this one hypervisors. Click OK. I'll select that IP set. And now what I need to do is to actually add either networks or individual devices to this IP set. So I'll click on add. Now I've already got some aliases defined, so it makes my life a bit easier. And what I can do is just basically pick out that node, then click on create. I'll then repeat that for nodes 1, 2, and 3. So I've now got an IP set I can reference for anything involving those 3 nodes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat this, except for management devices. So at this stage, we've defined some IP sets as well as aliases, and we could actually go back to our firewall rules and update all of these to make it a bit easier to understand, but we can actually consolidate these rules as well, and that's by creating what are known as security groups. So if we go to security group, click create, and I'll give this a name. We'll call this hypervisor access, for instance. The name's self-explanatory, so I'll just click create. And I now need to create an actual rule within that. So I'll click on add. The direction is inbound and it's set up to allow the actual connectivity. So for the source, I'm going to select out my management devices, and for the destination, hypervisors. I can enable this because it's not actually in use yet. Set the protocol to TCP. The destination port, I want 8006 as well as 22. And then I'll just say management devices to hypervisors, for instance. And click add. I'll select that, and what I'll do is I'll duplicate that, and I'll set that to allow hypervisor to hypervisor, basically. So that's hypervisors, if I could spell, hypervisors to hypervisors. So I've now got a security group that's set up to allow the management devices to get access to the hypervisors, as well as to allow the hypervisors to get access to each other. Well, now that we've got a security group which covers all of the hypervisor access that we need, what we can do is go back to our firewall rules, and instead of clicking on add, we can click insert security group. We've only got one security group available, and it's automatically picked that, but I do need to specify the actual interface, and I'm going to give this a comment of hypervisor access, for example, which again would help if I could spell. So I'll click on add. And that's gone to the top of the list. Now, it doesn't mention anything much about the details. You'd have to go all the way back to the security group to find out exactly what's going on. But if we go back to our rules here, if we enable that option there, so what we've got through that one simple rule is access between all of the actual hypervisors themselves, as well as access from the actual management computer. You might notice as all of a sudden Zorin 2 suddenly started to move across, and it should start up shortly. But what I can do is I can start disable these individual rules. In fact, I can actually remove them altogether. But it means just through that one rule that I've got there, I've got everything I need to cover hypervisor access. I mean, come back to our security group here. We've defined it here in terms of hypervisor to hypervisor, management computers to hypervisors. If we come back to our IP sets, we've got, there's a hypervisors defined there. These are our management devices. At the moment, it's just one computer. And then, of course, you've got our aliases defined in terms of just names instead of IP addresses. But it should make things a lot easier to manage going forward. I mean, I don't have to do anything as far as that one rule is concerned. If I need to make any modifications, so if, for example, I need to add more hypervisors, I just need to update the hypervisor group that I've got here in this IP set. If I need to give more computers management access, I need to just edit the actual IP set here for actual management devices. I don't necessarily have to add more aliases. I mean, I could just use IP addresses within the IP sets if I want, but by having all these layers, it just makes things, to me, a whole lot easier to manage, and it's a lot simpler just having that one rule, I would say, going forward. So, as I say, I can remove all of those rules now. They're no longer necessary, but it means I've now got the management access that I need into the hypervisors, and the hypervisors have got all of the access that they need. And it's just through that one security group. Now, one final thing that I'll say about the rules that I've set up for these hypervisors is that they do work for me, and they are pretty much the default sort of rules you could set up. So when Proxmox is first built, it gets one interface, VMBR0. Now, granted, I've since added in an additional interface for storage and another one for the actual cluster traffic, but everything really takes place on that one interface, VMBR0, unless you've made some changes. So if, for instance, you've actually made Proxmox VLAN aware and you're now using sub-interfaces, then your rules to get remote access to Proxmox need to be based on that interface. Likewise, the communication taking place between these hypervisors for me is over that original interface, VMBR0. But if you've again introduced VLANs or you've changed the behavior of how these actual hypervisors communicate with each other, in other words, if it's on a different interface, you're going to need rules to allow that traffic over that interface instead. Now, the firewall that we get with Proxmox VE can actually also be applied to your virtual machines. Now, by default, it is disabled and it does have to be configured on a per VM basis. So although we've got it enabled at the data center level, because it's being disabled at the virtual machine level, this actual virtual machine has no restrictions. So at the moment, I've got this remote computer has got access to the web server on this Zorin 2 computer I've got. I've also got a local computer which has got access to the web server as well. Now, I can restrict access to that web server remotely because I've got an upstream firewall appliance, but there's nothing protecting local access to the virtual machine. So this firewall is actually extremely useful, especially if you've got an operating system that doesn't have some form of personal firewall, because you can actually use this firewall to restrict that local traffic. In other words, VM to VM traffic, or even potentially VM to hypervisor, if there is some way for the actual virtual machines to connect to the hypervisor locally. Another benefit that you get out of this is that the firewall is independent of the actual operating system on that virtual machine. So if, for instance, a hacker were to get elevated privileges on a virtual machine, they do have the potential to override the firewall, whereas unless they've got access to the hypervisor, they can't do anything about this firewall. And as well as restricting inbound access, you can also restrict outbound access on this firewall. Now, just like I warned with a hypervisor, before you actually enable a firewall on a virtual machine, it's best to create rules that allow access in the first place. And that's because there's a built-in implicit deny rule. The difference between the virtual machine, though, and the hypervisor is that you won't be able to get local access. Now, just to demonstrate that, though, if I go to the firewall option here, click on Edit. If we enable this firewall, then I click on OK. If I give it long enough, the firewall will then kick in. And as you can see, by default, it's going to start dropping traffic. So if we come to our remote computer, try to get access to the web server here. So I've just done Control F5. You can see it's starting to spin its wheels. Go over to my local computer, we'll try the same from there. Yeah, it's just spinning its wheels as well. And that's because we've enabled a firewall on this virtual machine and it's just blocking all inbound access. So in other words, we actually need to set up some rules to allow access to that web server. I mean, you can still get access to the actual console session because that's taking place through the actual Proxmox hypervisor, but we can't get access to the applications or the actual services on this actual computer, and that's where we need the rules for. Now, rules for a virtual machine have to be applied to the virtual machine itself. And to do that, you pick out your virtual machine, select its firewall, and then start adding your rules in here. Now, if you go to the data center level, it's not going to stop you from actually creating rules that would potentially apply to your virtual machines. They just don't have any effect. It's the same as if you go to hypervisor and start creating those sort of rules here. It makes no difference because those type of rules only apply to hypervisors. So as I say, you've got to actually create and apply these rules to the virtual machine itself. Now, they do try to make things a bit more easier. They give you aliases and IP sets. Now, if we click on the Add button, though, to take advantage of things like that, for instance, what's particularly interesting is if I click on Source, you can see that I'm getting access to IP sets and aliases that were actually defined at the data center level. So this is very useful when you've got a lot of virtual machines and you need to take advantage of the same sort of IP sets and aliases. You can just define them all at a data center level. Having said that, you can make life a whole lot easier by actually using security groups. We don't get to define them here, but we can actually define them at the data center level. So we can set up common rules in the form of security groups at the data center level and then start applying those security groups to the virtual machines. Now let's say, for example, I've got multiple web servers and I want access to all of them from the same source. Well, to make life easier, what I can do is create a security group and then apply that security group to those virtual machines. So I'm going to click on create to create a new security group. I'm going to call this one web server access and click create. I'll select that security group and now I need to add a rule. For the source, it's best to pick a group. Now, for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to keep things simple. I'm going to pick out the one for management devices because that encompasses my actual management computer, specifically this computer, which is the remote computer. For the destination, well, in my case, the virtual machine that I've got has only one interface, one IP address, so there's no real gain in actually specifying that. If I want to, if I've got virtual machines that have got multiple interfaces, I could, for instance, set up a group that encompasses the networks that the actual interfaces are in, for instance, and define that there. But just to keep things simple, I'm just going to leave that blank because it's not really going to make any difference to me. I will enable this rule. Keep things simple, I'm going to pick out the macro for HTTP because that's all that this web server supports anyway. Then we'll give it a name or a comment of HTTP access. The good thing about this is that if somewhere down the line these web servers needed HTTPS access, I could add that in. I could also remove this at a later date. So there's a lot of flexibility here where I've defined a security group that applies to multiple virtual machines, and I can affect all of those virtual machines through this one security group. So as I say, that makes the administration a whole lot easier doing it this way. So if we go back to our virtual machine and then select the firewall, what I can do is just insert that security group. So I'll pick that out from the list. Now, what I can do, if this virtual machine did have multiple interfaces, I could also restrict that rule to that specific interface that I want. So for example, maybe the production interface. That way I wouldn't be allowing access to it through, say, the management interface. Likewise, if this had been a management rule, I could have set it up to only allow access through the management interface. But again, for the sake of this demo, there is only one interface, there is only one IP, so for me there's no gain in being specific. So I'm just going to enable this rule. This particular rule is to allow access, it's not to deny access, so it doesn't really matter. But we'll give this a comment, say web server access, click on add. And now we've actually got a rule to allow access to the web server. The only thing to point out is that we've got an implicit deny rule going on here. We're not actually logging anything, so it would be better to actually have a rule in here at the end to drop all of the traffic. So I'm just going to put that rule in and just say block everything else. I'm not going to enable that because if I click on add, it goes right to the top of the list. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to edit that and I'm going to set that to warning because we do want to keep an eye on what traffic's being blocked. And then I'll enable that rule. So the good thing about this is that this makes it a lot easier to manage rules for multiple computers because going forward, all I need to do is just modify that actual security group and it'll apply to all of my web servers. Now, ideally, it would have been better to have applied these rules before we enabled the firewall, but as I said, I did want to demonstrate the fact that if all you do is actually enable the firewall, it also blocks local access, which is different to how the hypervisors work. But the key point is we've now got a rule in the form of a security group, which is allowing access specifically from this remote computer, but it's dropping access to everything else. So if we go back to this tab, if I hit Control F5, you can see I've now got access to that Apache web page. If I go over to the local computer on the other hand, hit Control F5, it's just sitting spinning its wheels. So in other words, I've got rules in place to allow access from the remote computer. So that's the same sort of rule that I would have in place on an upstream firewall. But the key thing is that this firewall is now actually blocking local access, which is something that that upstream firewall can't do. The traffic never goes anywhere near that of the firewall. So this is extremely useful, a very useful extra layer in your security to have. And if you do actually want to keep an eye on what's actually being blocked, you can just go to the log page here, and there's, well, yeah, networks can be quite chatty, so there's a lot of things being blocked, but that includes access to port 80 from this local computer that we've got. Now, just like other computer systems, sometimes things don't work as expected, or sometimes they just don't work at all, in which case you need to be able to do troubleshooting and investigation to find out what's causing the problem. Now, with Proxmox, what we've got is at a hypervisor level, you can go down to the firewall setting here and pick out the log, and you can start to get logging information about traffic that's being dropped, for instance, here by the firewall. And you can do the same with your actual virtual machine. So if I pick out that virtual machine, there's its log setting that's showing me all the traffic that it's dropping. The key thing to point out is that although the firewall actually has a built-in implicit deny rule, that rule isn't actually logging anything that it's actually dropping. Now that's the reason why I create rules like these ones here at the end, which actually set up some logging. So granted, they don't have a hit counter, which would have been beneficial, but at least they're actually logging information, so I get to know what sort of traffic is actually being dropped. So that's extremely useful. If you're finding something isn't working, you can have a look in the logs and see if the actual firewall is actually blocking access to something. Now, the rules that we've been defining have been done through the graphical user interface, but when it comes to troubleshooting, sometimes you need access through the command line. Now, you could go in through a console session. In my case, I've opened up an SSH session to node 1. And what I'm going to do is swap to the folder where these actual rules are being stored. So that's /etc/pve/firewall. So it's the same folder that I mentioned when it came to trying to fix a problem where if you got yourself locked out, for example. If you have a look in this folder, you've got the original cluster.fw file I mentioned before. If you have a look at that file, it's now got extra entries in. It hasn't just got this option up here to enable and disable the actual firewall at cluster level. We've got aliases, IP sets, and so on, including the actual rules themselves. But it's also got the actual files that go with the individual virtual machines themselves. So this one here, 102.fw, is the actual set of firewall rules and the actual setting to enable or disable the firewall for this Zorin 2 computer that we touched upon earlier. So as you can see, we've got a rule here to allow the web access, but also another rule to drop access to everything else. So this is an extremely useful way to be able to get alternative access to these actual firewall rules. You could use it for automation as well, even for restoring actual files from backup, for example. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, as that'll help get the video out to more people who might find it useful as well. If you've got any comments or suggestions, please post those in the comments section below. And if you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yes, do subscribe. Just remember to set the bell icon to actually send you notifications when new content gets released, although I also post to Twitter as well as Facebook. If you'd like to help the channel and support it, you can actually make contributions through PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. I've also got links to Patreon, and there's also the join membership option for YouTube itself. Patreon and YouTube members do have the option to actually benefit from early access as well. But above all, many thanks for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one.